Ahoy friends, welcome to building the Alpha Dory. I'm Dan, and this is a project to recreate a 1890s era racing dory of the type built at Marblehead by William Chamberlain. Anyway, thanks for stopping in, and today we're hoping to get to finish cleaning up the arms of the frames, feet of the frames, and mark the feet of the frames for cutting the half flap joints that attach the frames together and nail them to the bottom of the dory. Anyway, let's get out into the shop and get to it. Yeah, one of the hopes with this story is that it'll make a excellent camp cruising platform. Of course, it's got the it's got 4 seats in it, 4 thwarts that run across the boat, and a little tiny stern seat, which they call a cuddy or a cubby or something. Anyway, it's basically a little stern seat slash storage compartment where you can put line or navigational aids or whatever, stash stuff out of the weather at the stern of the boat where you can access it. So the hope is eventually to also set up a series of removable slats that could easily fill in between the seats and make a fairly comfortable sleeping platform. And if that way, if you wanted to, you could head out to any of our local islands or up some quiet little estuary and anchor off for the evening. Maybe make yourself a meal, or possibly bring something along so it was already prepared, so you wouldn't have to cook it on the boat. And then just spend a pleasant night on the water. You'd want some sort of a boom tent or a tarp or something thrown over the sleeping area, just to keep any rain showers off and to keep the dew away even. I was sleeping aboard Centennial one evening with a buddy of mine. He's like, "Oh, you know what, I may sleep out on deck." We thought better of it, and when we woke up in the morning, the deck was like literally just soaked. There were pools of dew everywhere, so we were both thinking it was probably good that we slept below, because you can get a lot of dew out on the water. Fog and whatnot rolls in during the evening hours. Alright, so we got these the sides of the arms of the frames fairly well cleaned up. Took the saw wiggles out of them. And those are looking good for cutting the half lap joints. We don't have to worry about the bottoms because those will overhang the half flap slightly, and then that'll all get trimmed flush once we've glued and riveted the lap joint. Okay, so what I've gone ahead and done is separate the frame arms, which I just cleaned up, into 3 piles. So you can see the difference between the number 2 and 3 frames and the number 1 frames, which these were. So there's 4 number 2s and 3s cut from the same pattern, so it doesn't matter which is which. 2 number 1s, which are a very similar pattern to the number 4s. They're pretty much interchangeable. There's a little bit more curvature to the number 4 frame than on the number 1 frame. A little bit fuller at the turn of the bilge. You can see the difference there. So, but they're really almost the same pattern. And the angle, the thing that makes the number 4 fuller is the angle at the bottom of the frame, which really I'm not cutting the angle into these frame arms at this point. I've left them long, so the angle doesn't really matter. And like I say, they're more or less interchangeable. But anyway, so I've got 2 number 1s and 2 number 4s. So from now on, once that bottom angle goes on, then then there is a difference between them, and then it matters. All right, so next thing to do is to mark the bottoms, mark the width that the bottoms of the frames, the feet of the frames, are going to get cut to. So yeah, let's do that now. All right, so the first thing we're going to end up doing to mark the feet of the frames. First thing we've got to do is finalize the bottom width. So we're going to make the final cut to the width of the bottom. Now, this isn't going to be the final cut to the bottom bevel, the angle of the bottom bevel, but it is going to be the final determining factor of the width of the inside of the planking. We're going to be just reducing it ever so slightly. Got out my Fulton Guaranteed Tools hand plane, and we'll be going at it. So I'm wanting to sort of follow the run of the grain of the wood here, and I'm looking to put about a 45-degree bevel on the inside of this planking edge, and I probably want that bevel to be about 1/8 of an inch. Now what that's going to do is it's going to give some strength to the top edge of this board so that it won't tend to split out and splinter along the inside edge. So we're knocking off any sharp splinters or anything. And it's also going to give us a little bit of a waterway and a place that you can get in and clean along this garboard edge, rather than stuff getting trapped and wedging in behind a feather edge on this board and sort of prying. If you had some grit that got in the seam between the garboard and the bottom plank and you had a feather edge here, then you'd have the grit prying back that feathered, that sharp feather edge, and it would be damaging the planks and, like I was saying, raising splinters and whatnot. And what we'll do is we'll mark the feet of the frames right off this bevel here. That'll give us the total width for the frame bottoms. And then when we go ahead and take and do the final bevel in this direction, we'll be beveling right up to the beginning of this inner bevel. So we'll be beveling the bottom for the planking off of this bevel rather than the inside surface of the board. Okay, so there's one side beveled, and what we'll do is we'll shift the bottom over to this side of the horses, clamp it back down, and then do the same on the other side. Alright, so with it shifted over, I'm going to cut the same bevel on this side. Now this should be a relatively fair line here because it was drawn from the pattern, which you got to put a certain amount of care into making your patterns, cutting out the pattern stock. As long as your pattern is got a good fair curve to it, and you trace your pattern carefully without allowing it to move or wiggle on you, then you should have a good line to cut to. And like you saw a couple of videos ago, we cut the shape out on the table saw, which is one of the best ways to cut a really nice fair curve, freehanding it on that table saw, because the saw itself is pretty good diameter. I think it's like 10 inches. So so it cuts a good straight line, and it cuts a good curve too. It's not going to be wandering all over the place like a bandsaw could be, or a jigsaw or something. Now, of course, way back when, these bottom bits would have been cut out with a handsaw, which is another good way to cut a nice fair line. You can't get a handsaw, typical handsaw to cut a curve very easily, but it'll cut a nice, gentle, fair curve like is on the bottom of this Dory. Alright, so that's looking pretty good on this side. Like I said, I'm just taking off 1/8 of an inch or something. So it's maybe 4 or 5 passes with a sort of typical amount of blade showing on the hand plane. Just knocking that edge off. Enough to keep this from splintering or being damaged by any grip that might try and work its way down between the planking and the bottom. Alright, so the next step is to lay out the feet of the frames on the bottom where they're going to end up. Alright, knowing where each one of them is going to go, now we can come along with our magic marking tool, and looks like this one needs a little bit of an edge put on it. Of course, back in the day, they wouldn't have used pencils in your average Dory shop anyway. They would have, no pun intended, all the marking would have been done with awls. Actually got another little scratch awl here someplace, which actually came from a local boat shop. Oh, here it is. You can see it's a great marking tool. And yeah, this would have been used to, you could mark hundreds of dories with this, versus how many dories could you mark with a pencil before you broke it or wore it out or whatever. As long as you don't lose the scratch awl, it'll make you 1,000 dories. Just keep using it over and over. Now the line can be a little bit more difficult to see. With the scratch awl, the marking is really dependent on, well, the sharpness of the awl for one, but also the type of light you've got in your shop. If you can get some decent light to so you can see the shadows made by the depression of the scratch awl, it reads just as good as a pencil line, if not better. Alright, so what we do is once we got the piece of wood in place on the boat where we want it. We just grab our pencil and mark the underside. And yeah, you just want to kind of hold the pencil fairly vertical, and maybe hold the bevel of the pencil so that the lead is going to be vertical, and just bring it in underneath, right along that freshly beveled edge you just cut, and just mark the bottom frame like that, and that'll be perfect because the thickness of the pencil is adding a little bit of a width to the frame in this direction. And then when you strike the bevel with the bevel square for the bottom of the frames, you'll be right on target for the width of the frame there. Now the other option you could do if you're building a traditional old-timey dory, and this is kind of a cool way of doing it, is if you don't have a single piece of oak, the correct width for your bottom frames, which if you were using grown crooks, then you'd have two frames with bottoms on them as well. And at that point what you end up doing is something like we've got here, all right? You make slide-by frames. So imagine that there's arms coming up on either one of these bottoms. So this is half of a frame, this is the other half. What you do is you put them on the bottom, slide them to the point where you need a certain amount of overlap, but just slide them to the point where the bevel for the frame comes up where you want it on the bottom, and then you nail them together, bolt them together across the bottom here. Now that's super cool if you're doing like say mass production, because you can have different width bottoms for different length boats, and you can make up a whole bunch of frames in advance and then just plunk them down, slide them, nail them together, and you've got frames the perfect width for your dory bottom. And as long as these are half lapped and nailed, or a bolt nailed, or a clinch nailed, or riveted together, they're not going anywhere. That's going to be a nice beefy frame. But whereas this is a racing boat, and we're one at a time in here. We're not making 50 sets of frames and then trying to fit them to a couple dozen different bottoms. We can put in the time and effort to make a single piece frame right across that spans the entire bottom, which could possibly be a tiny bit stronger maybe, but it's definitely a little bit lighter and a little bit of a cleaner look, a little bit easier to keep clean and whatnot. You don't have that joint between the frames where moisture can settle. Not that that's a huge deal, but it's just one of the small advantages of a single piece bottom frame. Alright, so we got that all marked out. We're ready to roll. And I'll go mark the others. Like I said, these ones are, I know that the centerboard box is going to be at least 3 inches wide. So as long as I got the bottom of the frame within 1.5 inches of the center line, then I can use as much as I need out here to make the frame good and rugged and get a decent half lap joint. So I want to mark this one starboard. I want to mark this one here port. And as you're doing this, you'll start noticing that the line you're drawing is not exactly at 90 degrees degrees to the frame, especially bow and stern. Here on the center line, it's pretty close to 90, within less than a degree. But bow and stern, it's going to be 4 or 5 degrees off. And the fact that it is off is going to mean that the, well, say on the bow, the front of your frames are actually narrower than the back of your frames, because you want those frames to set along their full edge width. You want them to set smooth against the planking of the boat, and the planking of the boat is curving as it follows the shape of the craft. So that frame is going to be beveled slightly, and you'll notice that initially when you start marking these frames, and it's not something that you want to try and correct for or anything. And you've got to keep in mind that when you set those frame arms on, you want to be setting them at the greatest width that's marked on the bottom of on your feet, rather than at the narrowest width, because if it's at the narrowest width, all of a sudden you end up with a frame that doesn't touch at the wider section of the boat, at the wider part of the frame, so you end up with too small of a frame. So you want to always go with the larger width, and then you shave off the excess wood. And you shave off that excess width, and as you shave it down, the planks come right in and smoothly nest against the frame and follow the shape of the bottom. Alright, so we're looking good. We got all these marked off. I'm also going to be putting an arrow to show me which way is forward, which way is aft on these. That way I won't get anything screwed up when I go to put them together. Here's hoping, fingers crossed, right? Thanks for stopping in for another episode of Building the Alpha Dory. Feel free to leave any comments or questions in the comment section below, and we'll try to address them in a future video. And tune in next time when we start cutting the frames and cutting the half flaps and putting those together. Anyway, see ya. Goodbye.